is being monitored. And we did that to make sure that the folks that were going to give us the monitoring access, it wasn't going to be by individual. It was going to be the aggregate of the region and the basin. And I think we strive for that because you want your groundwater levels to be understood. If you come in and impose something from the state and there's a fear that the data would get out in some way and come back to harm somebody that's providing the data, you have a catch-22 there. And so if the state were going to venture in that arena to provide help with data, it should be along the lines of the resources to get the voluntary compliance that comes in an aggregate format, but not on the individual to penalize. And if you did that, I think you'd end up advancing the ball considerably.
Yeah, I have a short comment here. I've worked in a number of basins throughout the state. My experience is more along the lines of what I've heard John say, is that there's a lot of data out there. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to figure out the status of a basin. And our bigger basins, our major basins, all have groundwater models. There certainly is a role for the state to help out more. Certainly management should be done locally. But my experience is, I had to smile when John said it, is that I used to work at a water district, and I know the stresses that water district staff work under. There's the board of directors oftentimes is elected by local people. So there's strong local self-interest. And I believe there needs to be some kind of hammer, bad cop, some kind of requirement that certain fundamental objectives are met, such as stable water levels. And how you get there is a local decision. And even where you want to put your water level is a local decision, as long as it's done in an open, collaborative fashion, as we've said. People buy off on certain impacts. But that to me is the bottom line.
Certainly not a comprehensive list by any means, but a couple of thoughts for state support. We have not had a Bulletin 118 since, I think, 2003. That's something DWR does a really great job on, and it is an indicator of basin health in virtually every basin. We do have groundwater models in a lot of the basins. We used to have a Central Valley-wide groundwater model, which can be useful not only to inform things like Bulletin 113, but a lot of times when a region does a region-specific groundwater model, we can use the Central Valley-wide model or a broader model to help with a boundary condition. So just a couple of sort of, simple, tangible things, but not cheap.
I'll just note there actually is money in this year's governor's budget for an update on Bulletin 118, so we're hopeful that that'll get funded soon.
Great. I think that's perfect timing to switch panels. We do have 10 minutes if folks want to stretch their legs and give some time for the next panel to come forward. Okay, we're going to ask everyone to settle back in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the introductions of the next panel. As you'll see in the agenda, this next panel is the focus of local authority. Tools, authorities, and incentives. What do we need to provide to improve the funding, the assessment, the monitoring, the enforcement, and everything we've been talking about already this morning? On the panel, we have Mr. Leon Sheptetsky, professor of the practice at the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment and executive director of Water in the West. We have John Swigard, who's the general manager of Merced Irrigation District. Eric Everett, general manager of Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District. We have Supervisor Linda Seifert from Solano County on behalf of California State Association of Counties, and Vanessa La Piedra, Senior Water Resource Specialist from the Santa Clara Valley Water District. Thank you all very much for being here today. And Professor, perhaps you can start us off today. Thank you.
There we go, I'm on now. So my name's Leon Sheptetsky. I'm at the Woods Institute for the Environment at Stanford, and my primary job there is I run the Water in the West program, which is a program that fosters interdisciplinary research on Western water issues at Stanford. I feel a little bit awkward addressing this group, and I had a similar experience. I think it was the gentleman from Sacramento when they called him to speak at the panel. My reaction was, no, you've got the wrong person. I'm not the one you want. And there's a couple of reasons for that. But what I will say is our group has done a lot of really interesting work on comparative groundwater policy, and that's what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about. My two caveats that I gave to Karen at the Water Board when she called me is, my first caveat is I didn't do most of the work myself, so I'm summarizing work that other people did, but that's okay. And the second caveat is I'm relatively new to California, so it's a little bit awkward to be sitting here in front of a room of people that have been living and breathing this stuff for so many years and pretend to tell you what you should be doing, which I hope I'm not doing. But my background is I'm a lawyer. I taught at the University of Virginia Law School. Before that, I worked for an NGO that did a lot of work on water issues. So I do have a lot of experience on water management issues in a number of states. And Karen, maybe she was just looking for speakers, insisted that in fact was an advantage because I can share experience from other states. So maybe we'll do that just a little bit. So those are my caveats. So what I'm going to talk about, the title, I'll just go to the title of this panel, or the objectives, is to say what tools, authorities, and incentives are available to help local agencies manage groundwater sustainably. And I guess what I'm here to report, and this is all based on work that a researcher named Rebecca Nelson has done over the last several years, comparing California groundwater policy to policies in different Western states and other countries, primarily Australia. But she also did an extensive study of groundwater management plans throughout California and tried to identify what was in those plans that was positive and was working. So when you ask what tools, authorities, and incentives are available, I think there's a lot that are available, and the results of the research is not just that they're available, but they're already largely being used in California. They're just not all being used in the same places and at the same time. So there's a diversity, the benefit of the diversity of local entities that California has. Some people might consider it a bit chaotic and long for the firm hand of state control, but a huge benefit of the diversity is it's like a petri dish, and these districts have been trying lots of different things, and some of them have been working, and that was the result of Ms. Nelson's work. So what I'm going to try to do is identify several elements that are in groundwater management plans and other groundwater management efforts in California that she identified. And I would say that the three things I'm going to focus on, they all meet three criteria. One criteria is that someone in California is actually doing it, okay? It's out there, it's being used. The second criteria that I'm going to focus on is that the ability to do it, the authority that localities have, not necessarily the mandate, but certainly the authority to do these things under existing California law and programs could be clearer. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying it could be clearer and more uniformly applied. And the third element, I hope, of all these factors that I'm going to talk about is that they're all central to good groundwater management. I will say one broad overarching issue that the research found, that this study found, is that particularly, obviously this doesn't apply to special districts or to local ordinances, but one big problem with the AB 3030 plans is that there was no clear mandate in the statute that they even be implemented. And so it's, in many cases, it's even hard to find information about the extent to which the plans have been implemented. And the one overarching message is that there needs to be some clear program, whether it's under AB 3030 or some other version of the law, where the plans that include the elements I'm going to talk about actually get implemented, and not only that they get implemented, but that there's some follow-through, that the plans, the status of the implementation of the plans is assessed, reported on, and that the plans are flexible and can be changed depending on how well things are going on the ground. So that's the big overarching point. And what I'm going to say about all these things, as I said, they're all things, it's a little bit, the other thing that's a little bit awkward is these are all things that people in this room are doing already. And so it's a little bit odd to come and report on research informing everybody in the room what they're already doing. But I think they're points that are worth emphasizing, especially if the state's looking at making these things clearer. So one critical element in a groundwater management plan or other tool is that, and I'm just going to use the term basin management objectives out of the AB 3030 statute, it doesn't have to be that tool, is that the goals at some level be expressed numerically. I'm not saying the state has to tell the localities exactly what parameters they should be managing for. As people on the previous panel observed, every basin is different, and there could be different metrics in every basin for what constituted sustainable management, and the localities could be free to choose those. But it is important that the goals, whatever those metrics are, that they be expressed in some fashion quantitatively or numerically. One example of how this is done in other states is in Texas. Texas has areas of intensive management focus, groundwater conservation districts that are in overdraft, and the statute requires those districts to have something called a desired future condition, which sounds a lot like a basin management objectives. The statute does not tell the districts what those conditions, what parameters those conditions have to focus on, but the statute does require that they be expressed numerically. So, and again, there are, I won't, in general, I'm not going to cite chapter and verse in terms of which districts in California, which localities are using these. I would just refer you to the report that Ms. Nelson did called Uncommon Innovation, which is actually cited in the, there's a link to it in the announcement for this meeting, and it's available on the Water in the West website as well. So that's one element. A second element that's absolutely critical is that the groundwater planning be closely linked, and implementation of the plan be closely linked with local land use decisions, land use planning decisions, and implementation of land use plans. This is something that's happening in the desert Southwest very commonly, Arizona being an example of the most robust version. There are several places in California that are implementing it as well. but there's the standards and procedures in the groundwater management plan have to be linked to standards and procedures in local land use ordinances. That includes both water use, demand management, and also protection of recharge areas, which is particularly in California critically important. Obviously, the mechanics of this would have to be worked through in the law, but when local land use changes sort of outstrip groundwater use, it puts groundwater managers in a difficult position facing hardened demand. So the third issue that I've sort of called out is, and again, this, I'm not suggesting it should be a mandate, I'm just suggesting that it should be clear that local authorities have this power, and that is some authority for controlling withdrawals and limiting drawdown. Now, the current AB 3030 law puts a priority on replenishment and alternative supply, and it only gives localities the authority of limiting extraction if they've found that those options, replenishment and alternative supply, are insufficient or infeasible. And I would suggest that we need to take a look at that prioritization and make it clear that if, again, look, it's a question of local control and what's best for that locality, but it could be that in a given locality, demand management and controlling extraction is a better tool, and it could be in other localities that replenishment and alternative supply is a better tool, but it needs to be clear that localities have both authorities. The fourth issue is, which the last panel talked about a good deal, is data collection, and I won't talk about that much, except to make it clear that it has to be, there has to be some element of uniformity, and the data has to be shared. You can't make good decisions without good data, but more importantly, the public can't understand the decisions that are being made unless that data is shared publicly in an effective manner. So it's not just that the data has to be collected, it's not just that it has to be available, but it's really important that the data be communicated to the public in a way that they can understand the issues facing the basin. The fifth issue I was going to mention is connections with surface water. And again, the gentleman from the Nature Conservancy covered that extremely well, and I won't go into the reasons for it in detail, except that, again, this is something that should be, it's currently an option in AB 3030 plans. It's mentioned in the statute, but again, it's just something that has to be clear that the groundwater, the basin management objectives have to include some assessment of the effects of withdrawals on surface water, and I would suggest that it has to be also included in any definition of sustainable yield, that the groundwater withdrawals aren't having a measurable effect on surface water. And again, that detail of what the level of effect would be is something that would have to be worked through. And the final point, which is a closely related one, is the protection of environmental values and groundwater-dependent ecosystems, which is closely related to the effects on surface flow. But again, I would suggest it should be clear that localities that have important ecosystems that are dependent on groundwater that they want to protect, that the tool is clear, that they can build protection of those ecosystems into their basin management objectives, and that that tool is available for them if they need it. So that's the last thing I'll say is, and I was talking about this before the panel, is other states have done this before you all have, and in fact, in most cases, I think the research has shown that when groundwater supply is reliable and certain, it actually stimulates economic activity, and sustainable management of groundwater is critical for economic growth in all sectors that use water. So thank you for your patience. Thank you for welcoming me to Sacramento, and I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Thank you. Next, we have John.
Thank you. Good morning. Thanks for having me here today. I'm the general manager of Merced Irrigation District. Is this on? Again, thank you for having me here. My name is John Swigert. I'm the general manager at Merced Irrigation District. Keep it short about MID. We've got 45 years of conjunctive water management experience. Our district has had a lot of success although because of activities occurring around us, our basin has some challenges just like every other basin. One thing I want to be clear of is I think that with groundwater, we have to talk about water holistically. We have to talk about all water. This needs to be a careful, thoughtful, deliberative process, and from what I'm seeing, the administration seems to be doing that, and I think that's very valuable. But with groundwater, we have to look at surface water and groundwater interactions. We have to look at runoff and direct flow, stored water, recycled water. We have to be allowed as local water managers to exercise the storage, both groundwater and surface water. We need to begin looking further at stormwater inclusion for spreading for recharge within the allowable cultural practices within agriculture, wetlands, and refuges. And I think that if we're here to talk about groundwater today, but I think putting groundwater in a box from my local perspective of doing this for 20 years could be problematic. I think for this process to be successful, it needs to be science and engineering based exercise. It's always a challenge, but we have to try to do our best to remove the politics from this, both locally and otherwise. So, the way that I think folks have gone about it, and it's always difficult when you come to these things, you never know who said what before you and who's going to say what after. So there may be some repeat and there may be some new things, but I think in order to manage groundwater the right way, it's necessarily a somewhat time-consuming process. From an engineering perspective, you have to have a water balance. It has to be 3D. It has to identify the boundaries correctly. You have to look at groundwater and surface water interaction. You have to do monitoring to provide data to input into your model. You have to do model runs, and then you have to make decisions on how you're going to manage your basin and how you're going to implement that management plan. And then you have to do more monitoring, and then you have to compare your model and your management activities to see where you are and see if the assumptions were correct. You need to adjust, and you need to keep moving forward towards success. Again, it's a very deliberative process. It requires a lot of education. I mean, we're water managers, and we discuss these issues every day, and we use acronyms, and we know what we're talking about, but generally the public does not. So the education, I can't stress enough, is something that has to occur. And a deliberative process with education also builds trust at the local level. I know we're here to talk about some things that are needed, and I would suggest that reasonable time is needed, that we don't need to rush. Every basin is in a different condition. We need cooperation and coordination, and these things do take time. Trust building takes time. I think if we rush legislation, I think we're going to put everybody into a somewhat defensive mode, at least in some basins, and that's going to cause them to not want to work together, which I think we need to talk about. And again, every basin is unique. There are nuances within the basins, and we all have our own local political issues that are unique that we have to overcome. I just want to spend a minute or two explaining what's happened in our basin. Everybody is also, most familiar with their local experience. AB 3030 was, I think, a good first step in a lot of the steps the state has taken to try to deal with groundwater. In eastern Merced County, we formed a group called Merced Area Groundwater Pool Interests, MID, 3 cities, special districts, the county, and other pumpers within the basin. We've got some results. It's taken a decade. They came up with a plan prior to my arrival, and some of it sat on the shelf, and some of it resulted in implemented projects that have slowed the decline of groundwater reduction in our area. But one thing it did do as far as results is it provided an opportunity, again, to educate everybody in the basin. And although it's taken quite a while, we're at the point now where we have a model, and we've all agreed upon the runs that are going to be run through the model. And after a decade, we're still partners, we're still talking, and we're still working together. I would suggest that the earwimp process at the state level has been a good process. I think it's provided funding for a variety of projects in our basin. We were able to get 75% funding on the last go-around to do a disadvantaged community drinking water project, a watershed management study, and a local stormwater capturing and spreading program. And I think those are things that we need to continue to explore as they relate to groundwater management. And I would suggest that one thing the state could do is strengthen earwimp and continue to fund earwimp and thinking about increasing the funding to earwimp. Tools that are obviously going to be needed are funding. The state, I think, can provide assistance by continuing a lot of their grant programs through the propositions. In my experience, those have been very helpful. I think when the funding is provided by a state, it shows that the state has some interest. The locals would obviously provide some type of effort or funding. And I just think that at the local level, we're a little more nimble, not to get on the state, but you guys are a big machine. And we tend to move a little bit more nimble and get some results. And I think you can help basins get to where we are. And I think you can help us as a basin take the next steps that we need to take to have success. I don't want to leave here today without stressing the importance of the surface water. Without surface water in these basins under existing water rights, there's only one answer to a lot of the stuff that's occurred, and that's restrictions. And the restrictions are going to have economic devastation. We're all dealing with decisions that were made by others, and we have hardened demand in these basins, both in ag and in urban. And I think we need to make sure that whatever we do doesn't strand those investments and hurt all local economies. It's also going to hurt the state. But one of the biggest tools is wet year surface water. We need to keep that in mind. In lieu recharge is something that we're very proud of at MID. We do our best to get as much of our water rights in these wet surface years as we can into the basin to get wells shut off. And quite frankly, turning wells off in years when they're not drought is a very good tool, not only for management, but for reducing what could be drawdown conditions. We need that surface water so we can consider above ground and below ground storage. And the facility carrying capacity, no different than the state has infrastructure that needs addressing. I think the local level, we need to address infrastructure also so we can get more of that wet year water into our basins. And I would suggest a several step process. I think that the discussions about local effort are great. But at the end of the day, a lot of basins, locals are going to have to make tough decisions. And I think there's a real possibility at the local level that the leadership may not be there, and there may be some basins that decide to punt. And I think having the state there is okay as a very last resort, but I think the state needs to consider some type of middle step, a mediated process, maybe not an adjudication, but something that's more abbreviated that still can get some results and stop decline in the areas where it is. Obstacles, I think there's just going to be some distrust at the local level if the state's coming in too early and they're not given an opportunity to complete what they've started. You're going to have individual interest in individual right concerns. And quite frankly, as I mentioned before, there's been a big disconnect between land use planning and water managers in some of these basins, and it's led to conditions that we have to try to make sure that we don't repeat those things in the past, but we can deal with them without having economic difficulties. And finally, whatever we do, this process has to stand up to legal challenge because they will come. There will be self-interest, and there will be folks that will be willing to take on the system because they've got a lot of investment. And we need to be very cognizant of that because in my experience, it's always better to be collaborative at the local level than challenge each other and hold off efforts that we can actually make a difference. And again, going back to the surface water issue, I would just caution that everybody up here has input into what the state is doing. We're very concerned about the State Board Basin Plan Amendment process. I know we're here to talk about water, but the surface water is how we are going to be able to deal with the groundwater issue. And I think the difficulties at the local level are they don't understand everything that's going on like us managers do. And there's a lot of fear about taking surface water, restricting groundwater, and what's that going to mean to local economies. And again, I would just caution that I think we've seen what happens when surface water is handled in one forum and what happens to the groundwater after that. We just have to look across the San Joaquin River in our basin to see what happens there. So I'll stop at that, and I'll be willing to obviously take any questions when that time comes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Eric, next.
Thank you. I think I have a presentation. Could you hand me the? Thank you.
For you.
Yep.
I wondered who that was for.
I promise John and I didn't compare notes beforehand, but as we're both managers for Central Valley Water Districts, I'm sure there's a lot of common threads in the discussion. My name is Eric Avert. I'm the general manager for the Rosedale Rio Bravo Water Storage District. I'm also one of the participants in what's called the Kern Groundwater Management Committee, which has been working for 3 years to bring water interests within Kern County together. That effort has culminated recently with the drafting and execution of a Joint Powers Authority. What's interesting is when the Joint Powers Authority was circulated, 99% of the comments were focused on limiting the authority of the authority. And so that I think thread will weave through the discussion today, which is primarily focused on what authorities, tools, and incentives are needed for us to become sustainable. Let's see if I can do this. There we go. So we're talking sustainable groundwater management, and within the California Water Action Plan, it identifies 5 challenges. From overdraft, land subsidence, seawater intrusion, decline in ecosystem services, and degraded water quality. And you'll notice 1, 2, and 5 are bolded because within Kern County, those were identified by DWR in the CASGEM report as impacts. Sustainable means different things to different people. While the word has yet to be defined in the context of legislation, these, I think, provide us a good understanding of what people were looking for when they discuss sustainability. I would note that fundamentally the sustainability of a basin is in large measure gauged by the balance of supply and demand. In fact, I would argue items 2 through 4 are symptoms of number 1. So I apologize for those that might not be able to see this, but in the left you'll see a table, and this is the 2013 DWR CASGEM report for the Kern County sub-basin, and this is the basin that my district resides within. And you'll notice number 7 where it lists impacts. Kern is ranked with a 5 under impacts, and those impacts are listed as an asterisk below as subsidence, overdraft, and water quality degradation. So the discussion will be what tools, authorities, and incentives do we need to achieve a sustainable basin. First, let me talk about responsibility with authority. The plan, or the California Water Action Plan, calls for legislation that gives local and regional agencies comprehensive authority to address groundwater challenges. That authority must exist within the local level, and it must be able to be implemented in a way that overcomes a lot of the distress that local water agencies have. Again, we worked for 3 years collaboratively, but yet when it came time to actually take action, there was a lot of concern about who had that authority and how would it be exercised. I'm going to speak briefly about the existing authorities, tools, and incentives that we do have, and I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I think the goal today is to talk about where we're going and what do we need to get there. The authorities that we have are very, very limited. In fact, most of them reside within land use planning agencies, such as the county, where they issue well permits and other land use activities. Water districts really have very limited authority with respect to groundwater management. We do have a number of tools, however, and I just showed you one of them. The CASGEM information is a tool that water districts and groundwater management planning entities can use to understand where their basin is. Also, groundwater management planning acts such as the AB 3030 and SB 1938 are also tools, as well as the IRWINT process. However, these are primarily monitoring and reporting focused. They don't actually allow us to get in there and address or resolve challenges within the basins. And then finally, as John mentioned, we do have some incentives through grant funding. So let's talk about what's needed. With respect to the challenges within Kern and our need to move towards a more sustainable basin, we need some authorities that currently do not exist and provide some level or measure of local control. The first is a connection between the land use planning entities and the groundwater management planning entity, the ability for a will-serve approach, if you will, to well permits, where there is that connection and the coordination between the two different entities. Groundwater metering has been proposed a number of times. We need the ability to quantify the amount of groundwater used. However, while this is critical, we should all look towards alternatives such as satellite-based imaging and other tools which can be functionally equivalent but yet cost significantly less. Another authority is demand management, and I hate to say that because that basically is limitations on pumping. It must be, however, one of the authorities given to the local agencies. Without the ability to limit extractions, there is no ability to reduce demand if and when necessary. Data collection and reporting is also an authority that is needed. While this is linked to metering, it extends to other items such as water quality. Local agencies will need the authority to collect and report groundwater quality as well as quantity data to understand the current and future conditions of their basins. Finally, funding, and I think this represents one of the more significant challenges. Absent the ability or the authority of a local agency to raise or collect fees, then the state will be required to backstop all funding requirements. As I am sure we are all aware, there are a number of issues pertaining to 2018 elections and the local agency's ability to generate revenues. And then lastly, the ability to actually enforce those provisions that the local agency will need to implement in order to achieve a sustainable basin. With respect to tools, tools and incentives are kind of linked. For purposes of this presentation, I looked at tools more as the practical or the application type things, and incentives maybe more from a policy perspective. As discussed previously, local agencies will be coming to this issue with a wide range of issues as well as expertise. While there are many examples where local agencies have been able to actively manage their basin, others will have very little practical experience with most, if not all, of the issues raised. The tools that are needed should be developed to reflect the diversity of the organizations or entities that do step forward to manage their basins. The tools, in essence, are primarily driven by technical support and assistance, as well as the development of protocols and methods that can be available. Not necessarily mandatory, but maybe a list of protocols and approaches that a local agency can select from in order to achieve their sustainability goals and objectives. Those could include measuring complex interaction between surface activities and then mapping that to inform to inventory groundwater resources and aquifer parameters. And so measuring and mapping is a critical tool. Monitoring, building upon the concept of CASGEM management. We do need clearly defined requirements for both local control as well as any alternative that's put forward by the state. This will allow us to focus our resources where needed and direct what we are managing towards. And groundwater modeling is an excellent tool, but yet those models are not necessarily available in all of the basins, and so there's going to be technical expertise and tools that will be needed for those. In summary, when it comes to tools, there are 515 groundwater basins within the state. We don't need to create a new wheel for each one. Perhaps the locals just to get to decide how many spokes or what the spokes look like on the wheel, but there should be a standardized template that's available for people to choose from. Incentives. One of the biggest challenges I see is the ability to convince local interests that local control is better than a state backstop or adjudication. Local control, when compared to the alternatives, should be a more attractive option. Currently, any backstop is intangible. As a local water manager going forward with a group and saying we should develop a local entity to manage groundwater basin, the first question that all of the water interests are going to ask, what's the alternative? And is this better? Before we push them into the loving embrace of the state board, we should understand what that is. Technical support is critical. Perhaps most of the basins ranked high in the CASGEM process, which theoretically would be the ones that the primary focus would be upon, are ranked high for a reason. They typically have limited technical or financial resources to bring to bear. In addition, many of them have local groundwater pumpers that are outside of any organized district or entity, creates additional challenges trying to bring local control to the table. There will be a number of large sticks being used to push our respective basins towards sustainability. Funding is critical to actually accomplish the goal, and it should be the primary carrot. Allow funding to be delegated to the local entities with the expectation that they would use that funding to achieve and manage their basins sustainably. My final thought is that state water policy must be part of a groundwater sustainability discussion. with respect to my final thoughts, and this is maybe where John and I share a lot of common themes, groundwater and surface water, are an interconnected single resource. In Kern County, groundwater impacts that we see are a symptom of supply reduction. And then finally, number 3, limitations on groundwater pumping will be economically devastating for many areas. With respect to solutions in groundwater management, we should focus on both supply restoration as well as demand management. That concludes my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. Linda?
Good morning. First of all, I just wanted to say that I do have a bit of a cold, so I'm a little bit more nasal than I usually am. But indeed, it's a pleasure to be here, and I want to thank you for the opportunity of allowing counties to present. My name is Linda Seifert. I'm the chair of the Solano County Board of Supervisors. I also chair the Ag and Natural Resources Committee for CSAC, and I'm here on their behalf today. First of all, you should know the counties do have a firsthand understanding, I think, of the current challenges facing all of our citizens as it relates to addressing just water issues in general. And certainly groundwater has its own set of unique challenges. Much of what I've heard this morning, I think, as the 9th speaker today, has already been said. But I do think that regardless, it's important that I kind of let you know where counties come from. And so to the extent that I repeat, I apologize. I really want to spend my time really talking about 2 things. First of all is what counties think and the results of a survey that were undertaken by counties. And secondly, to just sort of give you an overview of what's happening in my own county, where we do, I think, have some fairly good, very positive groundwater management practices. Because there was some inquiries from the administration, CSAC did undertake and conduct a survey of the 58 counties in California to get sort of some thoughts with regard to groundwater management. There were 25 counties that responded, which is a pretty strong response. And so I thought what I would do initially is just give you a little bit of sense of where they were coming from. The themes are not going to be a surprise to you, since many of them have already been mentioned today. First of all, as I always say, sort of in the Richard Dawson sort of Family Feud form, survey says that counties are saying that groundwater resources are clearly best managed at the local level. Each area is unique, and one of the things that was real clear was that what might fit one area, whether it's suburban or large or rural or has more groundwater basins or fewer, that one size does not fit all, and that there are really some unique circumstances that are different depending upon locale. The second takeaway or survey says is that to maintain and protect our groundwater resources, we really must have expanded and adequate surface water availability, and that the interconnection between the two of them really can't be ignored. In addition, the survey really does mention, again, what's already been said, the necessity for a stable source of funding, a stable source of technical assistance, and really a clarification of county authority. So let's just take a couple of the themes that were addressed regarding funding. First of all, the CSAC survey results demonstrated that a consensus among small and large counties regarding the need for fiscal assistance to support and update technology to improve data gathering locally and for management and analysis. They also expressed support for investment in existing and new grant programs and integrated water management planning efforts. As it was mentioned, actually fairly just recently in this presentation, Prop 218 presents major impediment for local agencies who are attempting to pay for improved groundwater management actions. We also want to emphasize the frustration that's been expressed by counties regarding the numerous strings that are attached to existing financial mechanisms and existing grant programming. While counties appreciate and understand the need for safeguards, we urge you to simplify the processes, I know that's already mentioned, and to expand and to embrace the need for flexibility and creativity by applicants. Keep in mind that some processes will work for larger jurisdictions, and as I mentioned in the last panel, it was also addressed, but for small and rural counties, it becomes nearly impossible to submit applications and to qualify for funding. So some consideration should be really given to allocating funding based upon the needs of specific jurisdictions. On the issue of technical assistance, one of the reasons that some areas have been able to advance groundwater management is because of the technical assistance that's been provided by the state, such as the technical information on local and regional hydrology, monitoring, technical review, and guidance. If the state has an expectation for consistent groundwater management, then the state must assure that existing assurance can be maintained. One survey respondent captured the overarching theme of county comments on the topic of technical and financial assistance, and this is what that person wrote. It is difficult to develop the science-based information needed to garner public support and the local political will to address groundwater issues and fund groundwater programs. Technical and financial assistance by the state can help advance local understanding of groundwater conditions and convey the importance of groundwater management to local stakeholders and decision makers. So finally, on the last topic of enhancing local authority, counties have been asked what new or modified statutory or administrative authorities are needed to manage groundwater more effectively. As noted, funding and technical assistance are key to any effort to effective groundwater management. There's been a wide array of comments and ideas expressed regarding the enhancement of local authority, and those kind of fall into the following categories. Existing governance structures must be respected. Second, the need to clarify county authority to perform activities such as allocating groundwater or controlling pumping, accessing groundwater or well information, and finally to collect fees for such activities like under the Prop 218 issues. And then third, the need to provide appropriate protection from liability for any agency responsible for groundwater management that undertakes the process to limit and or to restrict groundwater extraction in an overdrafted basin. So those are a few of the highlights from the survey, and if I could, I'd like to take just a minute to really talk about what's happening in Solano County. And one of the reasons I want to say this is because it reminds me of that gentle reminder, and it's the old adage that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And so with that in mind, let me just sort of give you a quick overview of what we do here. In Solano, we have what we call a very collaborative groundwater management